On the surface, the life of Sarah Collins seemed like something taken straight out of a glossy magazine cover. She was a 31-year-old woman living in the upscale neighborhood of Brookfield Heights, Connecticut, a community known for its quiet streets, manicured lawns and houses valued well over $1 million. Sarah and her husband, David Collins, had lived there since 2016, shortly after their lavish wedding that made headlines in the local society pages. David, a prominent defense attorney with a reputation for being both brilliant and ruthless in the courtroom, had provided a lifestyle that most could only dream of. Their home, a sprawling colonial-style estate on Ridgeway Drive, stood as a symbol of success and stability. To neighbors and acquaintances, they were the perfect couple, beautiful, accomplished, and enviably wealthy. But behind closed doors, the reality was far more complex and darker than anyone could have imagined. Sarah had met David in 2013 at a charity gala in Hartford. At that time, she was working as a junior marketing associate for a mid-sized firm, trying to establish herself in her career. David, already a rising star in the legal world, swept her off her feet with his charm, confidence, and promises of security. Within a year, they were engaged, and by 2015, Sarah had left her job to dedicate herself fully to their marriage and to the image of being the perfect wife of a high-powered attorney. At first, everything seemed like a fairy tale. David spoiled her with expensive gifts, vacations to Europe, and fine dining experiences. Friends often commented on how lucky Sarah was, how David seemed to worship her. But slowly, cracks began to appear in the glossy exterior. By 2017, only a year after moving into their Brookfield Heights mansion, Sarah's closest friends noticed subtle changes in her demeanor. Once bubbly and outgoing, she became increasingly withdrawn, often avoiding social gatherings or showing up with rehearsed smiles that didn't quite reach her eyes. According to later testimony from neighbors and relatives, David had an intense and controlling side that was carefully hidden from public view. He dictated how Sarah should dress, who she could meet, and even how she managed the household. While there was no official record of physical violence, Sarah confided to her younger sister in late 2018 that David's words could cut deeper than any weapon. He belittled her intelligence, dismissed her opinions, and reminded her constantly that everything she had, every piece of jewelry, every item of clothing, the very roof over her head, was thanks to him. By 2019, Sarah began to feel suffocated in her marriage, yet leaving was not an option she dared to consider. David had both financial and legal power, and he made sure Sarah was aware of it. He managed their finances entirely, leaving her with little independence. Friends recalled that she often joked nervously about not even knowing how much was in their joint bank account. While some dismissed it as casual banter, in hindsight, it reflected the deep imbalance of control in their relationship. Then came 2020, the year that tested many marriages during the global pandemic. For Sarah and David, the constant proximity only intensified their conflicts. Neighbors recalled hearing raised voices late at night, though no one ever called the police. Sarah's few remaining friends noticed bruises that she dismissed as accidents, but no one pushed further. Outwardly, the couple still presented themselves as a united, enviable pair, especially on social media, where Sarah often posted carefully curated pictures of their vacations, anniversary dinners, and smiling faces. As time passed, however, Sarah seemed to retreat further into herself. By 2021, she was spending long hours alone, often walking through the neighborhood park or sitting silently at the local cafe, staring into her coffee. It was during these solitary moments, some speculated later, that she began to think about escape, though whether escape meant leaving David or something more drastic would remain at the center of the investigation. The pressure of the Collins marriage reached its silent peak in 2022. Friends noticed that Sarah rarely spoke about her future, and when she did, her words carried a strange detachment. Meanwhile, David's career flourished even further. He was taking on high-profile cases and was even rumored to be considering a run for public office in Connecticut. To the public eye, this was a man on the verge of becoming not just a successful lawyer, but a figure of political influence. Behind that image, Sarah was the silent wife, present for appearances, but fading away in spirit. By the fall of 2022, Sarah's sister later recounted, Sarah began to speak more openly about her unhappiness, though never in detail. She mentioned feeling like she was trapped in a cage and that David wouldn't let her go, not without a fight. These words would later take on haunting significance when less than a year later, on the night of March 18, 2023, David Collins was found dead in their master bedroom, his life ended by a fatal stab wound to the chest. But before the crime shocked the quiet streets of Brookfield Heights, the foundation of this tragedy had been laid years earlier in the subtle, invisible ways power, control, and fear shaped the Collins marriage. The morning of March 19, 2023, Brookfield Heights woke up to the kind of news that rarely disturbed its manicured calm. At exactly 6:42 a.m., the Fairfield County Police Department received a frantic 911 call from Sarah Collins. Her voice, shaky and panicked, reported that her husband, David Collins, had been stabbed inside their home at 214 Ridgeway Drive. Within minutes, patrol cars and an ambulance rushed through the quiet suburban streets that were more accustomed to joggers and dog walkers than flashing lights and sirens. When officers arrived, they found Sarah in her silk nightgown, her hands trembling and stained with blood. She stood near the staircase, pointing toward the master bedroom upstairs. Inside, David Collins lay on the floor next to the bed, a pool of blood spreading beneath his chest. The knife, later identified as one from their own kitchen set, was still embedded in his torso. The paramedics attempted resuscitation, but David was pronounced dead at 6:58 a.m. The time of death was estimated to be sometime between 2 o'clock and 3 a.m. From the very beginning, Sarah told officers the same story. She claimed that David had attacked her during a heated argument that escalated in the middle of the night. According to her, he had been drinking heavily after returning from a dinner with colleagues, and by the time they were in bed, the confrontation turned violent. Fearing for her life, Sarah said she grabbed the nearest object she could find, the kitchen knife she had brought upstairs earlier that evening after cutting fruit, and in a desperate act of self-defense, she stabbed him. The police secured the scene and transported Sarah to the station for questioning. Although she was not immediately arrested, detectives noted several inconsistencies in her account. For one, the position of David's body and the depth of the wound suggested a precise, deliberate strike rather than a frantic act of survival. The knife had penetrated his chest at a direct angle, piercing his heart almost instantly, a detail that forensic experts later explained would be unlikely in a chaotic struggle. As the news spread, Brookfield Heights residents gathered in small clusters outside their homes, whispering in disbelief. The Collinses had always seemed like the epitome of success, a couple people pointed to when they talked about the American dream. Now, police tape cordoned off their mansion, and Sarah, once seen as the picture-perfect wife, was at the center of a murder investigation. Local media outlets quickly picked up the story. Headlines read, "Prominent attorney David Collins found dead in suburban home," and "Wife claims self-defense in shocking Brookfield Heights homicide." Reporters swarmed the neighborhood, cameras pointed at the Collins residence, eager for any glimpse of the widow who had once been admired for her grace at charity events and gala dinners. The police investigation began with standard procedure, interviewing neighbors, collecting forensic evidence, and piecing together a timeline of events. Several neighbors recalled hearing raised voices and a loud thud in the early hours of the morning, but no one had called the police at the time. One neighbor, an elderly woman across the street, remembered seeing the Collins bedroom light flicker on and off around 2:30 a.m., though she admitted she thought little of it at the moment. When detectives searched the house, they found no signs of forced entry, no indication that anyone besides Sarah and David had been inside during the night. This fact placed Sarah directly at the scene with no alternative suspects. More troubling was the discovery of financial documents in David's office. Hidden in a drawer was paperwork related to his life insurance policy, which named Sarah as the sole beneficiary. The policy, worth nearly $3 million, had been updated just 2 months earlier. Bank records later revealed that Sarah had opened a new account under her maiden name in February 2023, and large transfers from the insurance company had been pre-approved to that account. For investigators, this discovery shifted the perspective dramatically. What Sarah initially painted as an act of desperate self-defense now carried the shadow of possible premeditation. Was she a battered wife who finally fought back against years of abuse, or had she orchestrated the perfect cover for financial gain? Meanwhile, the community was split. Some acquaintances came forward describing Sarah as quiet, submissive, and often isolated, lending credibility to the idea that she may have been trapped in a controlling marriage. Others remembered moments when Sarah seemed calculating, even cold, as though she were carefully maintaining an image. Former friends recalled how she often spoke about financial insecurity despite living in luxury, once remarking, "I don't own anything. If David ever leaves me, I'll have nothing." The introduction of these conflicting narratives, Sarah as the victim versus Sarah as the manipulator, set the tone for what would become one of Connecticut's most sensational trials in recent memory. In the weeks following the incident, Sarah Collins was charged with second-degree murder. Prosecutors argued that she had planned the killing, pointing to the insurance money and the deliberate manner of David's wound. Sarah's defense attorney, however, painted a different picture. A woman cornered in an emotionally abusive marriage who acted out of fear for her life. The stage was now set for a courtroom battle that would not only determine Sarah's fate but also unravel the layers of truth and deception behind the Collins marriage. The night of March 18, 2023, began like many others in the Collins household, but it would end in tragedy. David Collins returned home around 10:45 p.m. after attending a dinner with colleagues at an upscale steakhouse in downtown Stamford, Connecticut. According to the valet records, his black Mercedes-Benz pulled into the driveway at 10:52 p.m. Neighbors later recalled hearing the sound of the car door slam and David's heavy footsteps up the driveway. Sarah had spent the evening alone in the house. Surveillance from a nearby property confirmed that she had not left since mid-afternoon, when she returned from a grocery run around 3:15 p.m. A receipt from the local market showed she purchased a bottle of red wine, fresh fruit, and a package of kitchen knives, a detail that would later become central to the investigation, as one of those very knives was used in David's death. According to Sarah's statement, when David entered the house, he was already in a foul mood. She claimed she could smell alcohol on his breath and noticed the sharp edge in his voice when he asked why she hadn't answered his calls earlier. Sarah told detectives she had left her phone charging in another room, but David reportedly didn't believe her. This sparked an argument, one of many that had allegedly taken place in their marriage. Sarah said the argument followed a familiar pattern: David accusing her of disrespect, Sarah trying to defend herself, and his voice growing louder, sharper, and more threatening with every exchange. By midnight, tensions were high. She claimed David poured himself another glass of bourbon and continued to berate her, criticizing everything from her cooking to her appearance. What happened next remains the most contested element of the case. Sarah's version of events. Sarah told investigators that sometime after 1:30 a.m., David's verbal abuse turned physical. She alleged he grabbed her by the arm and shoved her against the wall near the bedroom door. Terrified, she pulled away and stumbled toward the dresser, where she remembered placing the kitchen knife she had used earlier to cut fruit. She claimed David lunged at her again, and in sheer panic, she swung the knife in self-defense. The blade, she said, struck his chest almost instantly. She described the moment as a blur, David gasping, his eyes wide in shock, and then collapsing to the floor. Sarah said she dropped the knife and tried to call 911, but in her panic, she froze for nearly an hour, only managing to dial the number around 6:42 a.m., after sitting in shock beside David's lifeless body. The investigators' findings. But the crime scene told a slightly different story. Detectives noted that David's body showed no defensive wounds, no scratches, bruises, or marks that would indicate he had been in an altercation. His blood alcohol level, later revealed in the autopsy, was 0.07, just below the legal driving limit. While he had been drinking, he was not heavily intoxicated. More importantly, the knife wound was precise. Forensic analysis revealed that the blade had entered at a straight angle between the fourth and fifth rib, puncturing his heart. Experts testified that this was a controlled strike, not a wild swing during a frantic struggle. It was the kind of wound one might expect if the attacker aimed deliberately, rather than out of chaotic fear. In addition, investigators found no signs of struggle in the bedroom. The sheets were neatly tucked, objects on the nightstands undisturbed, and there were no overturned lamps or broken items that might suggest a fight. Even Sarah herself had no visible injuries beyond slight redness on her wrist, which medical examiners said could have been self-inflicted or the result of a minor grab. Then came the financial discovery. Just weeks before David's death, Sarah had inquired with the insurance company about the payout process should something happen to her husband. Bank records showed she had opened a new account under her maiden name, Sarah Whitaker, at a small credit union in February 2023. Investigators uncovered an email exchange between Sarah and the insurance provider discussing the transfer of funds, though Sarah's defense insisted these were standard inquiries made at David's request for estate planning. The timeline of the fatal night. Prosecutors reconstructed the timeline as follows. 10:45 p.m., David returns home. 11 p.m. to 1 a.m., argument between Sarah and David. 1:45 a.m. to 2 a.m., David is stabbed in the bedroom. 2 a.m. to 6:40 a.m., Sarah remains in the house without calling emergency services. 6:42 a.m., Sarah calls 911. The nearly 4-hour gap between the stabbing and the emergency call was seen as highly suspicious. When asked why she delayed, Sarah tearfully explained that she was in shock, unable to process what had just happened. Yet prosecutors argued that those hours were used to stage the scene and to contemplate her next move. The public reaction. When news of these findings surfaced, the story shifted from one of domestic violence to one of possible premeditated murder. Residents of Brookfield Heights were stunned. The Collins home, once admired for its holiday decorations and perfectly trimmed hedges, was now the centerpiece of whispered conversations and nightly news segments. Some locals sympathized with Sarah, pointing out the rumors of David's temper and controlling nature. Others believed the evidence spoke for itself, that she had planned the murder for financial gain. The revelation of the insurance policy became the tipping point in public opinion, with many concluding that the so-called perfect wife had harbored a deadly secret. The turning point. The inciting incident, the death of David Collins, set off a cascade of legal, emotional, and moral questions. Was Sarah Collins a woman pushed to the edge by years of psychological torment, who finally lashed out in fear? Or was she a calculating spouse who saw murder as her ticket to independence and wealth? The night of March 18th would forever be remembered not just as the end of David's life, but as the beginning of a case that blurred the line between victim and perpetrator, truth and manipulation. It was the moment when the carefully constructed illusion of a perfect marriage shattered, revealing the dark undercurrents that had always been there, unseen by neighbors, unspoken by friends, but undeniable in the aftermath of blood on the bedroom floor. The morning of March 19, 2023, marked the official start of a homicide investigation that would dominate Fairfield County headlines for months. Detectives from the Fairfield County Major Crime Squad arrived at the Collins residence shortly after the first responding officers had secured the scene. By 8:30 a.m., the once pristine colonial mansion on Ridgeway Drive was sealed off with yellow tape, crime scene vans lined the street, and uniformed officers kept back a growing crowd of reporters and curious neighbors. Inside the home, forensic specialists began their meticulous work. Every surface, from the polished hardwood floors to the satin sheets in the master bedroom, was examined for evidence. Photographs were taken, swabs collected, and fingerprints lifted. The first priority was to establish the sequence of events and determine whether Sarah Collins' story of self-defense could be supported, or contradicted, by physical proof. Crime scene observations. The bedroom itself appeared strangely undisturbed. On the king-sized bed, the comforter was smooth, pillows aligned, and the nightstands perfectly arranged. The only sign of violence was the pool of blood spreading across the cream-colored rug beneath David's body. For detectives who had investigated dozens of domestic homicides, the scene was atypical. In cases of spontaneous violence, chaos usually followed: toppled lamps, torn fabric, broken glass. Here, the silence of order raised suspicions. The knife protruding from David's chest was carefully removed and sealed as evidence. Detectives noted the precision of the stab wound. There was no hesitation mark, no shallow cuts that often appear in a frantic struggle. Instead, the single deep thrust suggested control. The medical examiner, Dr. Linda Harper, later confirmed this in her preliminary assessment. The knife had pierced cleanly between the ribs, directly into the heart, causing immediate collapse. Sarah's appearance also drew attention. Her nightgown had a light smear of blood, consistent with her claim of cradling David after the stabbing. Yet her arms, face, and hands bore no defensive wounds, scratches, or bruises one might expect if she had been attacked. A faint red mark on her left wrist was photographed, but Dr. Harper noted it was minor and could have been caused by anything from a firm grip to resting awkwardly against a hard surface. Sarah's initial interview. At the police station, Sarah was placed in an interview room at 10:15 a.m. Detectives Mark Reynolds and Carla Diaz led the questioning. Calm but visibly shaken, Sarah repeated the story she had told first responders. David had been drinking, he became verbally abusive, and when he shoved her, she grabbed the knife in fear. She insisted the stabbing was unplanned and that she acted only to save herself. When asked why she waited nearly 4 hours to call 911, Sarah lowered her gaze and said she had been paralyzed by shock. She described sitting beside David's body, crying and praying before she finally found the strength to pick up the phone. "I couldn't believe what I had done," she said, her voice cracking. "I loved him despite everything. I didn't want to accept that he was gone." Detectives pressed her on the details. Why was the knife already in the bedroom? Sarah explained she had been slicing fruit earlier in the evening and absent-mindedly carried the knife upstairs with her snack. Why was the room so tidy if there had been a struggle? Sarah claimed David had shoved her against the wall but that she stumbled back without knocking anything over. Her answers were consistent but, to investigators, suspiciously neat. Financial discoveries. Later that day, a team searched David's home office. In a locked drawer of his mahogany desk, they found the updated life insurance policy. The documents showed the policy had been renewed in January 2023, with Sarah listed as the sole beneficiary. The payout amounted to $2.8 million. Even more concerning was the discovery of Sarah's new bank account at Brookfield Community Credit Union, opened under her maiden name just weeks earlier. Records indicated she had inquired about transferring large sums into the account, including a potential life insurance payout. Investigators also retrieved email correspondence between Sarah and the insurance company, in which she asked specific questions about timelines for payment in the event of her husband's death. These findings raised the possibility of premeditation. Detectives began piecing together a narrative in which Sarah, trapped in an unhappy marriage, saw an opportunity for freedom and financial security. Interviews with neighbors and family. Meanwhile, investigators canvassed the neighborhood. Several neighbors confirmed long-standing rumors that the Collins marriage was troubled. One couple across the street recalled frequent late-night shouting matches. Another neighbor mentioned Sarah walking alone in the park, often looking upset. Family interviews painted a mixed picture. Sarah's younger sister, Emily Whitaker, described her as deeply unhappy in the marriage, recounting how Sarah once said, "David controls everything. I don't even feel like myself anymore." Emily believed Sarah was capable of defending herself but insisted she would never plan a murder. David's colleagues, however, painted him in a different light. While some admitted he had a temper, they described him as disciplined and ambitious, not violent. One colleague even remarked, "David could be harsh with words, sure, but I can't imagine him ever laying a hand on Sarah." The prosecutor's early view. By March 22, 3 days after the incident, detectives presented their findings to the Fairfield County District Attorney's Office. Prosecutor Rachel Donovan reviewed the evidence and determined there was sufficient cause to consider charges beyond self-defense. While the official arrest warrant had not yet been issued, Sarah Collins was now the prime suspect in what was being considered a possible case of second-degree murder. The district attorney's office emphasized two key points: the precision of the stab wound and the financial motive. Together, they painted a picture of calculated intent rather than impulsive defense. Sarah's public image. As the investigation unfolded, Sarah became both a figure of sympathy and suspicion. The media portrayed her in conflicting ways. Some outlets described her as a battered wife who finally fought back, while others labeled her a black widow who killed for money. Paparazzi photographs of her leaving the police station in tears circulated widely, fueling public fascination. By the end of March, the initial investigation had shifted from fact-finding to preparation for a legal battle. Detectives had built a foundation of evidence that challenged Sarah's version of events, but her defense attorneys were equally determined to show she was a victim, not a perpetrator. The stage was set for the next phase, one that would bring unexpected twists and force everyone to question where the truth really lay. By April 2023, just weeks after David Collins's death, the case had already taken several sharp turns. Investigators thought they had a straightforward narrative: a wife with motive and opportunity, a life insurance payout worth millions, and a crime scene that pointed to deliberate action rather than a desperate struggle. But as more evidence surfaced, the neat picture began to blur. Discovery of David's double life. The turning point came when detectives, following standard protocol, conducted a thorough search of David's digital records. His law firm provided access to his work emails, and investigators subpoenaed his phone records. What they uncovered painted a far more complicated portrait of the respected attorney. On David's personal phone, detectives found dozens of text messages exchanged with a woman named Rachel Porter, a 28-year-old paralegal who had worked briefly at his firm 2 years earlier. The texts, some affectionate and some explicitly intimate, suggested David had been engaged in a long-term affair. Records showed frequent hotel bookings in Stamford and New Haven under David's name, often coinciding with nights Sarah reported him as working late. Even more damning, bank statements revealed regular transfers of money, amounting to nearly $75,000 over 2 years, to an account belonging to Rachel Porter. The payments were disguised as consulting fees, but investigators quickly determined they were personal gifts. The revelation shook the foundation of the case. If Sarah had known about the affair, it added a powerful emotional motive. But it also introduced new questions. Had Sarah discovered Rachel and acted out of rage rather than financial greed? Or was Rachel herself somehow involved? Rachel Porter's testimony. Detectives brought Rachel in for questioning on April 10, 2023. Nervous and visibly shaken by the media attention, she admitted to her relationship with David but insisted she had nothing to do with his death. She described him as charming but manipulative, someone who promised to leave his wife but never followed through. Rachel also revealed something investigators hadn't expected. David had confided that he was planning to change his life insurance policy to remove Sarah as the beneficiary. According to her, David said he no longer trusted his wife and was preparing to list Rachel instead. If true, this could explain why Sarah may have acted quickly, ensuring she secured the payout before the policy was altered. The district attorney's office seized on this information. Prosecutor Rachel Donovan argued that Sarah likely discovered David's intentions, whether through snooping on his emails, overhearing conversations, or sheer suspicion, and decided to strike before she lost her financial security. Cracks in Sarah's defense. Meanwhile, Sarah's defense team faced mounting challenges. Her claim of self-defense was already under scrutiny due to the forensic evidence. Now, with the affair exposed, her motive appeared even stronger. Prosecutors could argue that Sarah acted out of both jealousy and greed. Adding to the pressure, detectives unearthed an old diary Sarah had kept in 2021. In several entries, she wrote about feeling trapped in her marriage, describing David as cold and controlling. One passage in particular stood out to investigators. "Sometimes I wonder if the only way out is if something happens to him. I hate that thought, but it crosses my mind when I feel like I can't breathe." Though not a direct admission of intent, the entry gave prosecutors ammunition to portray Sarah as someone who had contemplated her husband's death long before it happened. A new perspective on David. Yet the investigation also exposed troubling aspects of David's character that complicated the narrative. Interviews with colleagues revealed he could be ruthless, not only in the courtroom but in personal dealings. Several paralegals described him as intimidating, with one quietly admitting she left the firm because of his unwelcome advances. More startlingly, financial auditors discovered that David's law practice was under federal review for potential mishandling of client funds. If charges had been brought, David's career, and his carefully crafted public image, could have crumbled. These findings opened a new possibility. Could David have been planning to cut Sarah out of his life, both personally and financially, in order to protect his assets or start a new chapter with Rachel? If so, Sarah might have acted not simply out of cold calculation but from a place of desperation, feeling her world collapse around her. Public opinion shifts. As these revelations made their way into the press, public perception shifted dramatically. Sarah was no longer viewed solely as a possible black widow. Many began to see her as a woman caught in a toxic marriage with a husband who betrayed her, controlled her, and possibly planned to leave her with nothing. Talk shows debated endlessly. Was Sarah a murderer or a survivor pushed to the edge? Online forums split into camps, some insisting she was guilty of premeditation, others framing her as a victim of both abuse and betrayal. The grand jury indictment. On May 3, 2023, a grand jury formally indicted Sarah Collins on charges of second-degree murder. Prosecutors presented their case as one of calculated action. Sarah knew about the affair, discovered David's plans to remove her from his will and insurance, and decided to kill him before he could act. They emphasized the precision of the stab wound and the financial preparations she had made. But behind the courtroom doors, her defense attorneys prepared an entirely different strategy. They would argue not only self-defense but also introduce the psychological toll of David's manipulative behavior. They planned to present evidence of coercive control, emotional abuse, and Sarah's deteriorating mental state leading up to the fatal night. The mid-plot twist, David's affair and his hidden financial dealings, transformed the case from a simple domestic homicide into a tangled web of deceit, betrayal, and desperation. What once appeared clear-cut was now shrouded in ambiguity, with both sides wielding powerful narratives. For investigators, prosecutors, and the public alike, one thing had become certain. The trial of Sarah Collins would not just be about a stabbing in a wealthy Connecticut home. It would be about power, secrets, and the lengths people go to when their carefully constructed lives begin to unravel. By the summer of 2023, the case of Sarah Collins had evolved into one of the most closely watched trials in Connecticut. What began as a seemingly straightforward domestic homicide had spiraled into a layered narrative of betrayal, greed, abuse, and survival. The courtroom became the battleground where these conflicting truths collided, and the stakes could not have been higher. Sarah faced the possibility of spending the rest of her life in prison. The prosecution's case. On July 17, 2023, the trial officially began at the Fairfield County Courthouse in Bridgeport. Prosecutor Rachel Donovan opened with a sharp, deliberate statement. This is not a case of self-defense. This is a case of premeditated murder fueled by financial greed and jealousy. The prosecution laid out its narrative with precision. They argued that Sarah had discovered David's affair with Rachel Porter, knew he intended to change his life insurance policy, and acted decisively to secure her financial future. Donovan emphasized the details: the recently updated insurance documents, the secret bank account under Sarah's maiden name, and the inquiries she made to the insurance company just weeks before David's death. Expert witnesses took the stand. Forensic pathologist Dr. Linda Harper described the stab wound as a controlled, deliberate strike consistent with intent to kill. Crime scene analysts testified that the tidy state of the bedroom suggested no struggle had occurred. A financial expert confirmed the suspicious transfers and Sarah's hidden preparations. The prosecution's narrative was compelling. Sarah was not a woman acting out of fear but rather a calculating spouse who had planned her husband's death. The defense's counterattack. But the defense, led by attorney Michael Grant, painted an entirely different picture. In his opening statement, Grant spoke directly to the jury. Sarah Collins is not a murderer. She is a victim of coercive control, psychological torment, and years of manipulation by a husband who believed he owned her. On the night of March 18th, she did the only thing she could to survive. Grant introduced the concept of coercive control, a form of abuse not always visible but deeply damaging. He presented Sarah as a woman trapped in a gilded cage, isolated from her friends, stripped of independence, and subjected to constant criticism and intimidation. To support this narrative, the defense called Sarah's younger sister, Emily Whitaker, who tearfully recounted private conversations where Sarah described feeling suffocated and fearful of David. Friends testified that Sarah often seemed withdrawn, her once bright personality dimmed. One neighbor recalled seeing her with bruises in 2021, though Sarah had dismissed them as accidents. The defense also highlighted David's infidelity and financial misconduct. By revealing his double life with Rachel Porter and the looming federal investigation into his law firm, they sought to portray David as a man whose outward success hid a darker reality. Grant argued that Sarah's inquiries into the insurance policy were done at David's request, as part of his estate planning. Most dramatically, Sarah herself took the stand. Dressed in a modest navy dress, she spoke softly but firmly as she recounted her marriage. She described David's charm at the beginning, the slow erosion of her independence, and the constant criticism that made her feel worthless. With tears in her eyes, she recalled the night of his death. He shoved me. I thought he was going to hurt me worse this time. I grabbed what I could. I didn't want to kill him, I just wanted him to stop. Cross-examinations and tensions. The prosecution cross-examined Sarah relentlessly. Rachel Donovan pressed her on the timing of the 911 call, asking why she waited nearly 4 hours to report the stabbing. Sarah repeated that she had been in shock, but Donovan countered sharply, "You weren't in shock, Mrs. Collins. You were waiting. Waiting to make sure he was dead. Waiting to figure out your next move." Tension in the courtroom was palpable. Jurors leaned forward, scribbling notes as both sides clashed over every detail. Was Sarah's trembling voice genuine or carefully rehearsed? Was she a victim of abuse, or a manipulator using her gender and circumstances to mask her crime? Media frenzy. Outside the courthouse, the trial became a media spectacle. News vans lined the street and reporters delivered live updates with sensational headlines: Black Widow or Battered Wife? And $1 Million Murder, the Sarah Collins trial. Public opinion was deeply divided. Some sympathized with Sarah, seeing her as a woman finally snapping under years of control and betrayal. Others condemned her, arguing that financial motives and precise action revealed her true nature. Social media hashtags like #JusticeForDavid and #FreeSarah trended simultaneously, reflecting the national fascination with the case. Unexpected evidence. Just when it seemed the case had settled into a battle of he said she said, a surprising piece of evidence emerged. Forensic analysts reviewing David's phone uncovered a voice memo dated March 17, 2023, just one day before his death. In it, David spoke candidly about his frustrations. Sarah's been asking too many questions about the insurance. I think she knows something's changing. I don't trust her anymore. I need to get this finalized before she does something stupid. The memo stunned the courtroom. To the prosecution, it was proof that Sarah was aware of David's plans and acted quickly to secure her financial future. To the defense, it reinforced the toxic dynamic, suggesting David himself viewed Sarah with suspicion and perhaps treated her with hostility in their final days together. The emotional climax. As the trial entered its fifth week in August 2023, emotions ran high. Both sides delivered powerful closing arguments. Donovan urged the jury to focus on facts: the money, the preparation, the precision of the stab wound. This was not survival. This was strategy, she declared. Grant countered by appealing to the jury's sense of empathy. Sarah Collins is guilty of one thing: being trapped in a marriage she couldn't escape. She acted not with calculation but with terror. Do not punish her for surviving. The jury deliberation loomed, and with it, the final resolution of a case that had captivated a nation. On August 29, 2023, after 5 long weeks of testimony, arguments, and emotional revelations, the jury in the state of Connecticut versus Sarah Collins finally reached a verdict. The courtroom was silent as the foreperson stood, holding the folded piece of paper that would decide Sarah's fate. Sarah, pale and trembling, sat beside her attorney, clutching a tissue in her hands. The judge asked the jury for their decision. In a steady voice, the foreperson read, "On the charge of second-degree murder, we find the defendant, Sarah Collins, guilty." Gasps echoed through the room. Sarah's face crumpled and she buried her head in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably. Emily, her sister, wept in the gallery, while reporters rushed out of the courtroom to deliver the breaking news. The conviction marked the climax of a case that had divided the public for months. Sentencing. On September 15, 2023, Judge Harold Whitman handed down the sentence. He acknowledged the complexities of the case, the abuse Sarah claimed to endure, and the prosecution's arguments of premeditation. Yet, in the end, he stated firmly, "Taking a life, even in moments of desperation, carries consequences. The evidence presented shows intent beyond fear." This court sentences you, Sarah Collins, to 25 years in prison. The sentence sparked heated debate. Some argued that Sarah deserved life without parole, calling her a black widow who exploited her husband's wealth. Others believed she should have been acquitted, viewing her actions as the desperate survival of an abused woman. Aftermath. The Collins mansion in Fairfield was eventually sold, its luxurious rooms forever haunted by the scandal that unfolded inside. David Collins' law firm dissolved amid the federal investigation into his financial dealings, and his mistress, Rachel Porter, left Connecticut, never speaking publicly again. Sarah began serving her sentence at the York Correctional Institution in Niantic. Reports from inside suggested she kept to herself, often reading or attending counseling sessions. Some said she appeared resigned, while others described her as quietly determined to appeal the conviction. For Emily Whitaker, Sarah's sister, the outcome was devastating. In interviews, she expressed sorrow not only for losing her sister to prison but also for the unresolved pain Sarah carried. "She wasn't perfect, but she wasn't evil," Emily said. "She was trapped and she broke. I just wish the world could see that." Legacy of the case. The trial of Sarah Collins left a lasting impact on public conversations about marriage, abuse, and justice. Legal experts debated whether the case highlighted the justice system's shortcomings in recognizing psychological abuse as a legitimate form of danger. Women's rights advocates argued that Sarah's conviction showed how victims of coercive control could still be punished for their desperate actions. Meanwhile, true crime enthusiasts, documentary producers, and news outlets continued to dissect the story. Books and podcasts emerged, each framing Sarah either as a cunning murderer or a misunderstood victim. What remained undeniable was that the Collins story was not one of simple good versus evil. It was a tragedy born from secrets, betrayals, and choices that spiraled into irreversible consequences. Closing note. On the night of March 18, 2023, in the quiet suburb of Fairfield, a single act of violence shattered the illusion of a perfect marriage. Whether Sarah Collins was a cold-blooded killer or a desperate woman pushed to her breaking point will forever remain a matter of perspective. But the truth, perhaps, lies somewhere in between, hidden in the silent moments that no courtroom testimony or legal argument could ever fully capture. And so the case of Sarah Collins closed, leaving behind questions that may never be answered, and a chilling reminder that even the most beautiful houses can hold the darkest of secrets.